this and support our people in our faraway country, but that we always, in spite that we are far away from it, we keep it very close to our hearts. So we always remember Guatemala with a lot of endearment. So I'm very happy to connect back to it. So, well, I just will give a very short commentary on how we will work on the workshop. This is more like than a practical workshop, unfortunately, because we only have about 1 hour and some spare minutes to develop the contents. I will have to go a little bit fast on it, but please, if you have any questions, the best thing we can do is that you save them in the chat. You can write them in the chat. There is someone that's gonna be collecting the questions. And at the end, we will have a Q&A section where we can answer all these questions. Right now, I will start sharing my screen. Please let me know if this works. Just wanna be sure I'm on the right spot. Because, let's see. You see the full screen now?
Yes, I can.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, it's working, okay. So because I am in the full screen, I cannot see all of you. So the best thing we can do is that you can write the questions in the chat, and more or less after 1 hour, when I will try to develop the contents, we will be able to have questions and try to solve any things that might be pending that might have not been too clear for you. And so my only request is that please save your questions, put them in the chat, and we will check them by the end. Right now, the idea is to develop basically 3 points. The presentation is more or less divided into 3 blocks. And these blocks are like general introduction, you know, like basic things that you need to know to talk about the Maya. Then we will have basic notions of what Maya hieroglyphic writing has as basic elements or as basic units. And afterwards, we will be able to talk a little bit about campus. Hopefully we will have enough time for everything. But if you see that I'm going too slow or if I'm going too fast, you can also type it and my colleagues will tell me like, hey, Alejandro, you can slow a little bit or Alejandro, maybe you want to speed up things. So that's also more than welcome. In case someone is having troubles hearing me or basically there's a connection problem, please wait. Sometimes the Zoom gets overloaded and funny things happen. So sometimes you just need a few seconds to wait and see it working back again. So that's the only thing. And yeah, I think that's it. And please, I think everybody's microphones are muted right now. That's just to make it easier. So please write in the chat and I will be checking on that. Okay, so today we're gonna start, sorry? Oh, please, do you say something?
No, I didn't.
Okay, sorry. So today we're gonna start with this very short, brief introduction to Maya hieroglyphics or to Maya writing, whatever you wanna call it. And this general introduction includes the basic topic of who are the Maya. Usually when we talk about the Maya, people think that we're talking about a long dead civilization. It's like something that you will find only in the museums. And that's not true. Usually we'll think about the Maya in that way, as a long dead culture. But actually the Maya are still living, thriving in Guatemala, in Mexico, and in many towns, in many areas in these countries. So right now, today, because we're gonna talk about a specific element of pre-Hispanic Maya civilization, we're going to talk about the Maya of the past, the Maya of the old, what we call in Ahobal Paisha. And these people from the past, yes, they were there, but we're still here. There's still Maya population in Guatemala. There's still a living Maya civilization. And this is something that we should not forget. So the Maya essentially have fascinated the scholarly world with one of the most amazing and complex writing systems that has ever been recorded. And it's so complex that even today we have problems to tell the machines how to read it. There's no way of presenting a Unicode format to tell the computer, please read this in Maya. We cannot make the computers to learn how to work with it because it's too complex. We will be able to do it someday for sure, but not yet. today you can have a Google app to read hieroglyphs for you, like Egyptian hieroglyphs. You can do the same for translating inscriptions from Latin to any modern language, or from ancient Greek to any modern language. We have software developments for Ugaritic or for Hittite, hieroglyphic Hittite. This has in all these scripts, this has been possible because those scripts are quite conventional and quite systematic. The problem with the Maya hieroglyphic inscriptions is that they are extremely complex, in the sense that the scribes can play a lot with the signs. They can do so many things. And that's something very, very hard when you have to teach a machine how to work with that. So this is just as a short topic. The Maya hieroglyphic writing is, up to today, one of the most complex hieroglyphic systems you will know. And the Maya lowlands, especially the region of Petén and the Yucatan Peninsula, was the main loci of the Maya civilization, but it's not the only place. We're going to check this right now. So when we talk about the Maya area or the Maya region, what we have in mind is basically this area that you can see in the screen. Let's see if I can bring my pen over here. This area, which is roughly the Yucatan Peninsula, which is this area above this line. The Petén area, which is basically northern Guatemala, Chiapas, the Tabasco Plains in Mexico, Belize, central and highland Guatemala, and western Honduras and western El Salvador. This area is basically what composes the Maya territory. And just for reference, our friends in the Ajobal area, they are living more or less here in what we call Sierra de los Cuchumatanes, the Cuchumatanes mountain range. These are the highest mountains, the highest non-volcanic mountains in Guatemala and Central America, by the way. How do we divide the Maya area? If we were able to make a cut from north to south, we will divide the Maya area in basically 3 different big zones. The way more extends is the one on the north, which is the lowlands, which basically corresponds to the Yucatan Peninsula, this area over here. The Yucatan Peninsula, the Petén lowlands or central lowlands. And this area is basically karstic plains, with limestone. And these are usually not higher than 1,000 meters or about 3,000 feet above sea level. Immediately south to that, we have the highlands, which are especially the highlands of Guatemala and Chiapas. These are areas that are very high. They are usually above 3,000 feet or 1,000 meters above sea level. And there are volcanic and non-volcanic mountain ranges in this area. And this is where today, most of the Maya population lives in Chiapas and Guatemala. In the case of the Yucatan Peninsula, most of them live in the coastal regions to the north. Final, but not last, or last but not final, we have the Pacific coast or the Pacific Piedmont, which is basically the volcanic plains that we have to the south, immediately in the coast of Chiapas and Guatemala. And these are today not populated by a lot of Maya, but we still have some Maya towns in this area, especially south of Lake Atitlan in Guatemala. So basically, you have flat area here, you have mountains here, and you have a lot of plains, a huge flat area to the north. So just to give you the idea, if we make this line, it's basically this cut. So we have the northern and southern lowlands. The southern lowlands are also called the central lowlands. We have the highlands, and finally we have the Pacific Piedmont, which is this area to the south. When we usually think about the classic Maya civilization, what people have in mind is the civilization that developed in the central lowlands. And this is where you will find that most of the archaeological maps of the Maya area point to you. They are telling you, oh, these are the best places you have to visit. You can find all the archaeological sites on this area. But actually, the whole area, the whole Maya region was populated and was densely populated. And we have thousands over thousands over thousands of archaeological sites. The small difference is that in the central lowlands, we have the huge states of the classic period, which developed very complex urbanism. But to the south, you can also find, you can also find archaeological sites. You can also find different kingdoms. It's just that they develop in a different way and in a different time. To the north, we can also find many archaeological sites. So basically the whole of the Maya area is overcrowded with archaeological sites everywhere. Some people are coming in, yep. So I want to make an emphasis on this because many people think that the Maya are just the guys that were living here in the center. And it's not like that. That's why we talk about Maya civilization on all this area. And this is super important to take into account because some people will say like, oh, but today in the Petén there are no Maya, but that's not true. We have the Itza Maya in San Jose, even though there is a small population. People will say like the Highland Maya are not Maya, but that's not true. They were there already 1,000, 2,000 years ago. It's just that usually when people think in archaeological, framework, most of them will make a focus on this area. And actually we have Maya archaeological sites in the whole region. So I just want to make an emphasis on this. Okay. There's one important feature that we need to remember, and that's that a lot of the inscriptions, like 95, 97% of the inscriptions that we know, I mean, Maya hieroglyphic inscriptions come from the central lowlands, come from Tikal, from Palenque, from Piedras Negras, and many other archaeological sites. So this is one important feature that, yes, it makes a small difference between the highland and lowland Maya. And in this sense, let me see if I can erase this. There's this important feature that we do need to remember, that most of the inscriptions that we are gonna see in Maya monuments come from this line to the top, basically. But we also have some scanty examples of Maya hieroglyphic writing to the south. We have evidence in the coastal regions. We have writing in Caminal Huyu. We have probably some examples in the Chama and northern Quiche area. So we know that also the Highland Maya knew something about writing. Unfortunately, we don't have more examples. And of course, we also know that the Spaniards, when they arrived to Guatemala, they saw codices in this area. They saw written books with glyphs, but they were destroyed, they disappeared. So this is basically Tikal. This is the general idea we have, like when we think about the Maya, we think about this place. And today it will work like that because most of the Maya writing examples come from this area, from the central lowlands. And this is the quintessential example of what we think about the Maya. But the Maya are not only the archaeological Maya, the Maya are still living there. There are still people working, living, loving, having families, trying to find a way in their lives. So I just want to keep this on the air, like the Maya is not a dead civilization. The Maya is still a living culture. This is a living civilization in Guatemala and in other places. So we already have the geographical reference more or less. And now we need the chronological framework. And this is important just for key references. Actually, you don't need to learn this by heart because this is something that you only need if you're gonna be an archaeologist. But basically, we're gonna talk about the pre-Hispanic Maya, yeah? The pre-Hispanic Maya, usually when we talk about their archaeology, we talk about three very, very big periods. One of them is the pre-classic. The pre-classic is basically divided in three big chunks. We have the early pre-classic, we have the middle pre-classic, and finally we have the late pre-classic. And these are basically the longest period of development of Maya civilization. We're talking about 2,000 years. Imagine, I mean, this is a period that's as big as the time that separates us from the Romans. So it's a big, big time. We're talking about 4,000, 3,000 years before the present. After that, we have the early classic and the late classic. So we have the pre-classic period over here. We have the classic period over here. Finally, we have the post-classic. Some people will divide the post-classic into early and late periods, But nowadays, it's seen more as one period. But again, it depends on who you're reading and what kind of interpretations they want to make. So basically, we have pre-classic, classic, and post-classic. Of course, this kind of framework tells you, there's a small bias telling you that whatever comes before the classic period is not so good, and whatever comes after the classic period is not so good too. So, there's a lot of people that don't like this kind of, terms, but these are the ones that we have, and these are the ones that we use every time. So, I mean, that's why I'm using them. But I don't want to put these like a criteria, like saying that the aesthetics or the culture or the sophistication of the pre-classic Maya was less than the one of the classic Maya. This is super important to keep in mind. The pre-classic Maya were as developed, as complex as the classic Maya. The post-classic Maya were also as developed, as complex as the classic Maya. And we have certain cultural traits that will change through time. This is super important because the pre-classic Maya are not the same as the classic Maya, and the classic Maya are not the same as those of the post-classic, especially because they had to respond to different kinds of challenges. The pre-classic Maya had a jungle to domesticate. The classic Maya had this jungle already domesticated, and they already knew how to use a lot of things in this area. By the time of the post-classic, there was a different kind of relationship to the environment. So all these elements, cultural and social, make these differences through time. That's why we can talk about pre-classic period, we talk about a classic period and a post-classic period. Just trying to go a little bit deeper into this, see what's going on here. For example, I want to focus only on writing or basically on imagery or iconography. In the time of the pre-classic Maya, what we see is that Maya writing is developing. It's actually in its infancy, it's starting. And the very first example that we have that we can more or less securely date, they belong to the year 300 BC. And these examples come from San Bartolo. So, 300 BC, you can put or take 100 years. So we're talking about 300, 200 BC. These are radiocarbon dates. And you can see that they're actually very small. These are very, very small glyphs. Actually, when you see them, you can see that they're about the size of one of your fingernails. So this is very sophisticated writing already at this time. But there's another point in here is that this writing is usually not used for the description of the histories of kingdoms, of the nobility, of the royalty. They are just basically used in association with murals in small secluded spaces that not everybody could see. So writing at this time is not for a public display on the open plazas. It seems that writing was something more intimate in a certain way. What is interesting is that at the same time in the pre-classic period, we have the huge development of masks that decorate buildings. There's a lot of display of public art. And this public art is basically this kind of representation that you can see here, with the heads of the gods being placed into the temples. And this kind of public art was everywhere. So if you dig in any site, if you go to Tikal, if you go to Cerros, if you go to Huashactún, and you go and deep into the deepest and earliest occupations, you will find a lot of buildings decorated with these masks. And these masks, as time passes by, they're going to be displaced. And this huge representation of gods and supernatural creatures will become less and less common. As time passes by, when we go to the classic period, the one that's taking the scenario, the one that's getting the light on him is the king. So at this time, by the classic period, we see that the huge mask with this public display of gods are less and less common until they disappear completely. And the kings are the main characters of all the imagery, of all the iconography, and of course, of the inscriptions. The kings are everywhere. For example, here in Bonampak, you can see the king fighting, but in front of his war captives. And you have the captains of war presenting the war captives who are laying here on these steps, while the victorious king stands watching over them. Where are the glyphs? The glyphs in this case are on top of them, and they are just adding us extra information. They are telling us the names of these characters. They are telling us whatever happened at this day. So these are like small descriptions and name tags. In this example to the right that comes from Palenque, we have the same situation. We have the portrayal of the king in a public ceremony, and the inscriptions are telling us about him. So there's a very big difference from those intimate small glyphs from the pre-classic period to those of the classic period. Now the inscriptions are performing with the king, and they're helping and providing information about him and about his activities and his family. You can see this also in this kind of murals. We also have these beautiful examples that come from Calakmul. Unfortunately, there are not too many, but in Calakmul, we have these market scenes actually. And in this case, for example, you can see a lady who is dressed in these very sophisticated dresses. She's beautiful and elegant. And here to the right, sorry, to the left, we have another scene of a Maya queen performing a ceremony where she is bringing an ancestor to talk with him. In this case, the glyphs on the top of this inscription are telling us the name of the character, while the glyphs down here tell us the name of the lady. So now the inscriptions are serving for the purpose of informing us about the people. They're helping us to understand the narrative that's going on. And we are more interested in historical characters than in the gods themselves. By the time when we get to the post-classic, there is an important thing that changes, and that's that writing is less and less common on public scenarios, or at least we have not a lot of good examples that have been preserved, because the post-classic period is also the time when the Spaniards arrived to the Maya area. And of course, the Spaniards destroyed a huge number of examples of Maya writing. So there's this problem with the evidence that we have from this time. What we do have from the post-classic period is the bark papers. We have the codices, and all the codices that we know today from the Maya area, which are only 4, come from this time, from the post-classic. So just take into account this. These post-classic books were essentially almanacs that daykeepers could use for calendrical calculations. And these are basically repositories of knowledge of Maya priests for generations. And it was not a coincidence that the Maya tried to keep this as safe as possible, and that the Spaniards, as soon as they knew about these books, they tried to destroy them. Because of course, if you destroy the culture that has been preserved in this, let's call them these hard drives of civilization, will make it easier to dominate another group. It's like if, for example, do you remember what happened with the Y2K phenomena, and everybody was freaking out in the 2000s because they thought that we're going to lose everything in our computers? Well, basically what happened with the Maya was that all their computers, which were these papers, were destroyed in the Spanish conquest and invasion of the Maya area. So you can imagine how big an impact it is. Another important feature that we need to address is that most of the classic Maya civilization was actually organized around the sites in the central lowlands. So most of the central lowlands were more densely occupied in the classic and pre-classic period. But as time passed by, these places in the central area of the Maya region were depopulated because of a very different phenomena. So by the time the Spaniards arrived in the post-classic, at the end of the post-classic, most of the Maya population in the Yucatan Peninsula are living in the coastal areas. Or in the case of Guatemala, in the highlands, like the Ajobal, like the Chuj, like the Quiche people that live in the highlands. And the central lowlands have been essentially, depopulated by this time. So even though when we think about the Maya, we need to take into account these movements of population. And I just want to put this into a bit of more context. By the way, these are beautiful examples of, well, I don't know the real name of the artist, but you can find him on Twitter as Sots. He produces this kind of reconstructive drawings from pre-Hispanic civilizations of Mesoamerica. And in this case, he shows you like how a Maya priest will be dressed, or a priestess will be dressed in the pre-classic period. And you can contrast the makeup and the styles with those of the Maya of 1,400 years later, you know. And they are still Maya, they're still the same people, but they are not dressing in the same way. You must understand that between the Maya of the late post-classic, we're talking about the 15th or 14th century, there's as much time between them and the pre-classic Maya as there is between us and the fall of Rome. You know, we're talking about 16th centuries. So Maya civilization continued to transform through time. And as I was telling you, the Maya are still here. They have not disappeared. For example, we have a Maya Peace Nobel Prize, you know, Rigoberta Menchú. And Rigoberta Menchú actually worked for the peace process in Guatemala in the 90s and 80s. And we still have a lot of people living in these areas. So I insist, the Maya is not a dead culture, it's not a dead civilization. So that's just to give you general background. Now we start with some more technical things. For example, where can you find glyphs? You can find glyphs in decoration, in adornments, you know, like ear spools. You can find glyphs in buildings, in different parts of buildings. You can find them in the stelae. You can find them in the tombs. Some tombs are painted and decorated. You can find them in portable objects. We're gonna see a few of these. For example, you can find glyphs carved on wood. You can find glyphs in stone panels that decorated palaces and royal courts. You can find them carving into bone. But most of the inscriptions that we know of the Maya actually come from two sources, from ceramic objects that have been painted, beautifully painted. And unfortunately, we can only get an idea of how beautiful the Maya codices of the classic period were because we have these examples in ceramic. But the Maya codices themselves, most of them didn't survive. So we only get this idea of how they must have looked like in the year 600 or 700 or 800. And imagine how beautifully worked they were. The other source, apart from ceramic objects, are stone objects, you know, panels, stelae, lintels, and most of these are what we have today in the archaeological sites in the Maya lowlands. And most of them were decorated with inscriptions, especially these inscriptions that tell us about the kings and their families, their deeds and their failures. In this case, for example, we have a Maya ruler on the top, seated at the highest position in the scene, receiving his captain, his war captain, who is bringing him captives. You know, all these guys are tied with ropes after the war, and they're being presented as war booty here. And of course, we also have the four surviving Maya codices, like the Madrid Codex, like the Dresden Codex, like the Paris Codex, and the Grolier Codex, which has been recently renamed Códice Maya de Mexico. I misspelled Mexico. I should fix that. So I'll just write it on top, Mexico. So the Maya Codex of Mexico, which has been recently renamed. These books were basically like this. They were folded pages, and they were open in different sections to check different data sets that were placed into these objects. So they are not like European books, but there are still books and there is still paper. So this is a very important fact because in the world, there were only very few civilizations that developed paper by themselves. And the Mesoamerican people, including the Maya, were among the very few that found out how to make paper. And this paper is made out of the amate tree, the bark of the amate tree. Amate is a kind of ficus. And the Maya used the bark as paper. So we're talking about all these points. Another thing that I think that's very important to address from the beginning is, how do you read Maya inscriptions? What's the reading order? Because, you know, if you see this thing here written in English, you can easily say like, oh, we should start from left to right, and we read in lines. But how do we do it with Maya inscriptions? In the case of Maya inscriptions, it's a little bit easier, maybe. You basically have to find the double columns. We read in double columns from top left to top right. And you can see how it goes from here. If you have a very big leaf at the beginning, usually you read that as one. And then you go in zigzag, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and so forth. If by the end you have one single column, you read it by itself. You know, it's independent. But usually you will work with double columns. So from left to right, from top to bottom, and zigzag, basically in this kind of movement. Okay, so now we have another point that's very important. Which of the Maya languages was written in the Maya inscriptions? Because we have more than 30 recorded Maya languages. Not all of them survived up until today, but we know that they existed. So there was a lot of linguistic variety in the Maya area. Today, the languages that have the biggest number of speakers are Yucatec Maya and Quiché. Yucatec Maya is spoken in Mexico and Belize, and Quiché is spoken in Guatemala. But we also have some dead languages like Chicomuceltec or Cholti, but well, they disappear in the late colonial period or in the early independent period. So we do have some records about them. I just want to put you into context about something that I want to explain right now. English belongs to a family of languages. Yeah? English is actually an Indo-European language, but let's not go so big and let's stay in the closest family, which is basically the Germanic languages. So English, if we check on the sources, we know that English has as a close relative Frisian. Frisian is a language that's spoken today in the northern part of the Netherlands in Europe and part of Germany. Both Frisian and English share a common ancestor, which is Anglo-Frisian, and this comes from West Germanic, and West Germanic itself comes from Proto-Germanic. So this Proto-Germanic tell us that there is a connection between the speakers of English and Frisian and Netherlandic or basically Dutch, German, Icelandic, Faroese, Norwegian, Swedish, etc. You get the idea. So all these languages are very similar. They share a lot of features, but we know that if you try to make a speaker of English understand Swedish, basically that's not going to work. We know that they cannot understand each other perfectly. Maybe they can know a few words that are very similar. Maybe they can, they can guess like, that sounds familiar, but I don't get it. Like you can see these kind of feelings in between languages. In the case of Spanish speakers, if Spanish is more familiar to you, it's like when you have Portuguese. We can understand a lot of Portuguese because Portuguese and Spanish are very close in a relationship that's close but not similar to English and Frisian. And Portuguese speakers can also understand a lot of Spanish. But what happens when you get Italian into the mix? Of course, if you read Italian, print Italian is very easy to understand. But when you hear it, it has a different intonation, it has a different rhythm, and a lot of the vocabulary is not the same. So it makes it a little bit harder for you to understand. And in this case, it's familiar, it's something that you might have some time to, if you give yourself some time to learn it, you can learn Italian so a little bit quickly. But, from starters, that it is not Spanish, it is not Portuguese, you will have a harder time to get it. Basically, this kind of relationships happen in the whole world. You have this kind of families of languages. And usually these families of languages can be easily spotted in a geographical sense. Like you will see like all these languages tend to be clustering together. And in the case of Germanic languages, of course, you can see this with English, which is spoken in England. And you can see this with German and Dutch and the Scandinavian languages like Norwegian or Swedish or Danish. So you see all these languages are connected in between them and they're close by. Of course, today we have a small issue, and that's that, for example, English and Dutch have become world languages. Now you have Afrikaans in South Africa. You have speakers of English in the whole of North America and Australia and New Zealand. But if we go to the root of the language, we know that it was originally very close to its brothers and sisters who want to call themselves out. Okay. The same thing happens with the Maya. The Maya languages come from something that we call Proto-Mayan or Common Mayan. It depends on the authors. And Proto-Maya actually had a lot of branches. It developed many branches, And these branches become more complex through time, and they become to be clustered into different groups. You have Yucatecan, you have Huastecan, you have, oh, sorry, I was not pointing. You have Huastecan, you have Yucatecan, you have Cholan and Ahobalan, you have Mamian, Quichean, and so forth. We can see this in shorter detail here. So Proto-Mayan was a language that we know must have been spoken around the year 2000 BC, more or less. Of course, there's no hieroglyphic inscription in Proto-Maya. Proto-Maya was never written. And this is something that needs to be very clear to us. But it's a language that must have existed somehow. And out of Proto-Mayan, in the classic period, there was a group of languages that was very prestigious. You know, it was a kind of language that everybody was trying to learn and that was recorded in hieroglyphic inscriptions around the year 200 BC or 200 AD. And this group of languages is what we call Cholan. Cholan at that time seems to be dividing into different varieties, but there was just one single written form. And that's the one we find in hieroglyphs. Today, the closest languages to Cholan are Chortí, which is still spoken in Guatemala, in Eastern Guatemala, and that was also spoken in Honduras at some point. We also have Chol, spoken in Chiapas, in Mexico, and we have Chontal, also known as Yocotan, which is spoken in Tabasco, in Mexico. So all these languages, which are basically the closest languages that we can connect to the hieroglyphic inscription, they serve as sources for interpretation because we find words in the hieroglyphic script, but unfortunately, we don't have a speaker of Cholan languages of the year 500 that he can tell us like, oh yeah, this word means this thing. So the closest thing, our best guess as epigraphist, is that we go to the descendant languages and we try to find words in these languages that make sense of the hieroglyphic inscriptions, of the things that we find in the glyphs. In this case, we use Chol, we use Chortí, we use Yocotan. But also, and this is very important for you to understand, Yucatecan languages also have a lot of vocabulary that's very close to Cholan. And this is not, that's why they are placed here, close by. So the relationship between Cholan languages and Yucatecan languages is quite similar to what we will find among Italian and Spanish, for example. But at the same time, you have many more languages. And Ahobal is here. Ahobal is also quite close to Cholan. But we have other Maya languages which are on the other side of the branches, like the Quichean languages, like Quiche, Cachiquel, Zacapulteco, and other languages. These languages are also Mayan languages, but they are very far apart from the other groups. And they belong to the branch that we call Eastern Maya, while the other languages are in Western Maya or Yucatecan. So just to give you the idea, Chortí and Chol speakers can understand each other more or less. They can understand a little bit of Yucatecan speakers, but if you put them next by to someone that speaks Pomchi or Quiche, they will be lost. As you, for example, as English speakers, you can understand someone that speaks English from the UK or Scots English, and you will get like, okay, I get what they're saying, maybe not perfectly, but I get it. But if I put you next by to someone that speaks Icelandic, you know, it's the same family, Germanic languages, but Icelandic is very far away from your own language. So just to put you in context, yep. So going back to this, we know that this language that we call sometimes Classic Maya, this language that was developing around the year 100 AD was the form of the Cholan languages that with time will become Chortí, for example. This language is the language that was written in the hieroglyphic inscriptions coming from Proto-Maya. So the inscriptions in Copan, in Palenque, in Tikal, throughout the whole of the Maya lowlands were written in this classic Maya form. So we know that the speakers of this language were basically the elite of these groups, and they were learning this language throughout the whole region. This is super important. This was a kind of lingua franca that permitted people, you know, to communicate from one kingdom to the other kingdom. And you know that a scribe writing in Palenque could read a text that was written in Copan, for example. So today, this is how the Maya languages are distributed. You can find a lot of them in Guatemala, in southern Mexico, and Belize. So I welcome you to learn some of them. They're so beautiful. For example, Ahobal is one of the most beautiful languages you can hear, or Chorti, or Yucatec Maya, or Mopan. They're so, so nice. And this is a very nice and interesting task that you can do at some point. For example, in Guatemala, if you want to visit us in Guatemala, just in our region, you can find 22 Maya languages spoken in one small country. You know, Guatemala is not bigger than, let's say, Massachusetts. So in this area, you have to learn 22 languages to communicate. Yep. In the pre-Hispanic period, the idea is that this classic Maya that I was talking about served as the language of communication in between different polities, different kingdoms, and different areas. Today, Spanish is used as this lingua franca in between different groups. Okay, so now we're getting to Maya writing itself. Maya writing is basically the most complex system that you can find in the ancient America, in the ancient American continents. And we know that the very first examples of Maya writing come around the year 300 BC, the ones I mentioned to you from San Bartolo. And we know that the very last scribes that knew how to use the system, they were using it around the year 1700 AD. And this is the year, close to the year when Tayasal, the last independent Maya kingdom, fell. So we know that the Maya writing itself, you know, the Maya writing system was basically used for around 2 millennia, more or less. So we're talking about a very long-lived hieroglyphic system. And as I told you, it was used to write classic Maya or classic Cholan, which was this elite lingua franca. You know, the different people learned this. And you must think about this in a very similar way as Latin in the Middle Ages. You know, everybody that was educated in the Middle Ages, when they went to the university, didn't matter if they spoke French, if they spoke English, if they spoke Spanish, because the language of science, the language of culture was Latin. So everybody had to learn Latin as the language of education at that time. So we must think that classic Maya was basically the same thing. Maybe you were, your mother tongue was Yucatec Maya, or your mother tongue was Tzeltal. But in the end, if you wanted to scale up in society, the language that you needed to master is classic Maya or Cholan Maya, or sorry, classic Cholan. Today, you can find this very similar to what English does in the world scenario. Basically, everybody needs to learn English if you want to find a good job, if you want to be able to move around, if you want to, you know, basically have more possibilities in your academic and personal life. And this is basically the same thing with classic Maya. And we know that scribes and the people that work with the glyphs were very important in the societies. You can see, for example, here we have a Maya scribe working on one of the codices, one of these bark paper books, painting over it. And we know that there were schools. We know that there was a long and complex system of transmission of the information. We don't have all the details, but for example, here you can see a teacher speaking to his students. The students are listening to the teacher and he is telling them the lesson of the day. You know, in this case, he's telling them about numbers. So we know that there was this kind of complex hierarchical system that allowed for the transmission of this knowledge. Therefore, the knowledge of Maya writing was very limited in the society. Not all the people could read and write. And this is probably one of the key elements because Maya writing is very complex, but it's also very iconic. So we know that many elements were made iconic on purpose because even if you could not read it, you could understand the figures there. And we will see that this is actually something that comes in handy in this kind of literate societies. We also need to account for the fact that there are about 15,000 examples of Maya writing, of Maya inscriptions that we know today, most of them from stone monuments and ceramic objects. And out of the about 1,800 signs that a Maya scribe will know at some point, ideally, you will only need about 300 to do a basic inscription. So even though a Maya scribe needs to know a lot of signs, when he's actually writing, he doesn't need to use all of them. And we will see why in a moment. I'm just gonna give a sip to my coffee. Give me one moment. Okay. So we have the basic notions of Maya writing, and I hope I can go through this quickly. What elements constitute or are basically the building blocks of Maya writing? You have the logograms. The logograms are basically signs that stand for one word. And this is when I was thinking about iconicity, or making signs that are very clear and transparent. In this case, for example, you have three signs, and these three signs stand for three different words. Probably most of you know what is here that we have here to the right. This is a jaguar, and this is the sign for jaguar, yeah, which is read in classic Maya as the word alam. The sign that we have here in the center is a reptilian creature, and this reptilian creature, let me see. Okay, thank you. I check the time. Okay. This reptilian creature that we have in the center is actually a snake. And this snake is what we call in classic Maya Chan or Kan. And the last sign here is another way of writing jaguar, but also as a generic symbol for felines, you know, like small jaguars, ocelotl, and jaguarundis. And this is a sign that we could read as hish, which is roughly translated as feline, any big cat of the jungle. So these logograms are essentially word signs. We have one sign for one word of the spoken language. So these are the words of classic Maya. We are reading words in a language that is long dead. In this case, for example, this sign that we have, the sign that we have here to the right is a sign for the verb to see, il. Or the sign that we have here, it is not a hamburger. I know it looks like a hamburger, but it's not a hamburger. It's a codex. It's one of these bark paper books that's folded. And actually the covering of this codex is jaguar skin. So this can tell you how important were the books for the Maya, that they were covering them in jaguar skin. So you have the jaguar skin, and in between the jaguar skins, you have all the paper jammed and folded as a hamburger, but not an actual hamburger. And we have more glyphs that you can find in this repertoire. You have the sign for Winnick, which is person. You have the sign for Wits, for mountain, shock for shark. And some people will say that actually the word shark in English comes from Maya, Yucatec Maya, shock. This is still controversial, but just as an interesting fact. We also have the signs for colors, for example, yash, which is green. We have the words for star, which is ek. We have the word for youngster or youth, which is chok, or again, our word for alam, the jaguar. So essentially, word signs are logograms. Yeah, one sign, one word. That's very easy to keep in mind. The second category of signs that we have here, it's a little bit more complex. It's what we call syllabograms or phonograms. And these are a little bit more tricky. And you have to keep in mind, if by any chance you did study the Japanese syllabaries, you know, like hiragana, katakana, they work in the same way. So these signs here, they just represent sounds. They just represent consonant, vowel, syllables. Sometimes they also simply represent vowels. And we have a complex repertoire of these signs. I think that you got a handout with basically the charts where you can find these signs. And please, if you have your handout with you, if you have it in your computer or you have it somewhere, you can have a look at it. And in the handout, you can find this, let me see. Oh, here, Catherine just shared the handout here in the, oh, sorry, you didn't find, okay. You can find it here. It's in the Google Drive. And in the syllabary, you can find a lot of signs, but they are just phonetic signs. So the only way you can make sense of them is when you put them together and you try to read the words. So let's try to do that. In this case, we have three examples. We have a, we have ki, and this together becomes the word ag. In the case we have here in the center, we have bu, and we have ku, and this becomes the word book or clothes. By the way, in classic Maya, some people will write B, other people will write E. This is the same sign, it's just an orthographic difference. So don't worry, it's not a mistake. It's just that sometimes we write the B, sometimes we're a little bit lazy and we don't write the apostrophe. The last example here is PC. So if you check in the syllabary, you will find this sign here as A, you will find this sign here as ki, you will find this sign here as pu, you will find this sign here as ku, this will be P, and this will be C, okay? And once again, we need to find, you know, in the descendant languages from classic Mayan, we have to get some information, how to understand these words, because we cannot ask a speaker of this language. They are all dead now. So we go to the dictionaries of Chortí, we go to the dictionaries of Yucatec Maya, any of the related languages. And for example, we find the word pits. And pits in Yucatec Maya, in classic Yucatec from the colonial time, it meant to play ball, the ball game. In Chortí, we have the word buhk, which means clothes. In Chortí, we also have the word ak, which means hueso or bone. So that's how we make sense of what we find. We're trying to find the lexemes, the terms in the modern Maya languages. And now you must already notice that there is a small thing that's happening here, and that's that the last vowel that's written is not actually being read by me. And this is a rule when you work with Maya writing. When you work with the syllabograms or the phonograms, sorry, the last syllable that's written, the last vowel is not read. And this is one important feature that you need to remember. Usually Maya words have a structure that's a CVC structure, a consonant, vowel, and a consonant. Or consonant, vowel, consonant, vowel, consonant. So Maya words usually don't end in a vowel. They end in a consonant. And this is very important that you keep this in mind. So in the syllabaries, you can find them in different shapes and colors. You can find that, for example, ba, B-A, ba, like this one here, has different forms. You can see that some syllables are more popular than others. In some cases, you can see that there's many examples for one, but in some other cases, you will find that a syllable has only one shape. It was up to the scribe to choose which of these varieties he will use in every inscription. And you must understand that for the Maya scribes, the syllabary was a playful thing, something that they will use to embellish the inscriptions. Maya writing was supposed to be beautiful and attractive to the viewer. And this is something that's very important even up to today. And just keeping with this, so it's not A, E, I, O, U. No, it's A, E, I, O, U. The next signs will be Ba, Be, Bi, Bo, Bu, and so forth. One important thing that you need to remember is that Maya languages have a kind of sounds that are not very popular in other languages, which are the glottal sounds. And you have cha, but you also have cha. You have che, and you also have che. Or for example, you have ka, but you also have ka. So ke and ke. It's not too hard. This glottal stop is basically just a pause in between the consonant and the vowel. And you can actually do it very easily. And just so that we keep this in mind, please remember about this ka. Ka has two forms. One is the fin of a fish, and the other is the complete fish, basically. So please keep this in mind. This will come in handy very soon. So basically with the syllabary, you could write everything that you want in classic Maya. But of course, the fact that you could combine logograms and syllables was more attractive. And actually the scribes do this very often, but they do it in so many ways that's very hard for us to read it sometimes. So that's what makes it very challenging when you approach Maya writing. So how to work with the syllables? Basically, you put things up together, you try to form blocks, and these blocks are usually a combination of different syllables. And in this case, for example, you have TB, and the result is tip. This last vowel that's not read, which in this case is E, is giving you information of the other vowel that's here, the one that's not omitted. We have two kinds of vowels. This is actually a little bit more complex, but for time reasons, we will leave it like this. We have the simple vowels and we have the long vowels. If all the signs share the same vowel, you have a simple one, you have a short vowel. But if there's some discrepancy in the end, especially when the last vowel and the previous vowel are different, you know that what is going on here is that there is a elongation of the vowel. Something is changing here. So instead of saying mash, we say mash. The X in Maya languages is read as sh. You know, like when you're trying to sleep and you tell someone, please make silence, shh, that kind of sound. So we have long and simple vowels. Just keep this in mind. I had some examples here for you. So for example, here we have ba-ki, or we have tb, or shib-i, or sa-ha-la. And the results, maybe you can make a screenshot of this so that you can practice with the syllabary later. You have baak, you have sahal, you have tib, and you have shib, for example. Also, if you want to save some time, many times in Maya writing, we have words that have two syllables, the same syllable repeated one after the other in a continuous way. So the Maya scribes invented or used this sign, which is basically 2 points. And these 2 points serve to point that this syllable is duplicated. So you read it twice. In this case, you could also write the word cacao by writing one ka and another ka. But if you can do it with the 2 dots, it makes it easier. You will be saving time and space and effort. So that's one way of working with this sign. We also have some scribes that will use the fish fin, you know, the sign that looks like this. They will write it twice, you know, like one ka here, another ka here, and a third wa here for cacao. Cacao is one of these very nice words that we actually find in context. Cacao, this is the chocolate vessel of Riazul, where it's also called the chocolatera of Riazul. And here you will find the word ka-ka-wa. Here the 2 dots are a mistake because they already wrote twice the ka. I think the scribes were a little bit nervous. But in this case, this is one of the finest examples that tells us the contents of the vessel. The inscription, the glyphs on the vessel are telling us that this was the vessel to drink cacao of a certain lord. And this is one of the few cases when we connect Maya glyphs with archaeological findings in a very straightforward way. When they found this vessel, what they did is that they took samples of the vessel itself to check the contents, you know, the remains of the contents. They sent the samples to the Hershey labs in Pennsylvania. And in the Hershey labs, they said like, oh yeah, we found chocolate in the vessel. This sample that you sent to us is true chocolate. So for the first time, we were able to demonstrate that the Maya glyphs were true in stating that the content of this kind of vessels was actually chocolate. So we know that the classic Maya were actually avid chocolate consumers. You know, today we have our coffee, but in ancient times in Mesoamerica, especially in the Maya area, people will be consuming chocolates and they will be consuming a lot of it. So we have multiple ways of writing. We can write the word mountain, for example, with logograms, specific signs, but also with a combination of logograms and syllables, or we could simply write it with syllables. And this is exactly what makes it so hard for a computer to read Maya writing. You have to learn so many combinations, and the combinations are so variable in between them. So this is something that I just want to put here on the table so that you know it. I know that I am running out of time, so I will go a little bit faster. Now you have the other topic that's very important, and that's the fact that Maya writing is also many times used as a playful element in Maya images. So in this case, we have the word for tune, the logogram tune for stone. You can find it sometimes as carvings being carved. So they are literally carving the sign for a stone. And sometimes we find this, the altars carved as the sign for a stone. So these are like 3D models of the glyphs, you know? Or we can find the glyphs for mountain widths in these animated forms, or even the glyphs themselves. You can see them here with full figure glyphs, you know, playing around, holding things. So we know that the Maya like to use their writing system in this way. We also have certain elements like the word hun for paper, which is the crown paper, or the paper itself, a Maya codex. It has a face because the Maya see the world in this animated view. And we also have, for example, here the sign for tok, which is flint. In this case, a king of Palenque is receiving the royal crown marked with the paper sign, but he is also receiving the elements of war. In this case, the tok, the flint, which is the spearhead, and the pakal, the shield. So he's receiving the emblems of the king as the crown, but he's also receiving the emblems of a warrior, you know, like a spearhead and a shield. I'll try to go faster. I know, okay. We also have a fragmented political world, which is represented by the emblem glyphs. And, you know, every city in the US, in Latin America, will have a shield, you know, like a coat of arms that represents the city. In the case of the Maya, we have something very similar, and that's what we call the emblem glyphs. So all these tiny polities you can find here, all these city estates that the Maya had, they were represented by one of these signs. And thanks to that is that we can actually create these models of how the Maya were interacting in between them. And checking the time. Okay. Now we're in the last part. This is the Maya calendars. And first, the first thing that you need to know is that we have the numbers. And we have numbers which are represented by bars and dots. But also the numbers, continue with this idea of animation. The numbers have animated forms. The numbers have faces. They have attitudes. And this is something that's still present in the Maya mindset, especially when we talk about the calendars, because the numbers reflect a certain kind of attribute for certain days, for example. I cannot go into the details, but you can see that they have different features and different aspects. And this is super important. This helps to identify the numbers through the inscriptions. So basically we have three main calendars that the Maya used. I think you all remember that the world was supposed to end on 2012, but that was just a mistake, a misinterpretation by some people. And now we know that this is not true. We know the world will continue. The Maya never said such a thing. But that calendar is the calendar we call the long count. And the long count is basically a chronogram or a chronometer, sorry, that starts on a point 0 and that it will continue ad infinitum. It will continue until the end of time. Yeah. And the long count basically counts days from this starting point, from this point 0. We have another calendar, which is the Tzolkin, which is the 260-day calendar. Today we call it Chokich in Guatemala. Also we call it Cholilal-Inale in the Cuchumatanes area. And we also have the solar calendar, the HAB, which is the 365-day calendar. So let's keep this three in mind. Actually, we know that the Maya had more or less like 10 to 12 calendars in use at the same time. They were really interested in this mechanics of calendrics and numbers, but the most frequent ones are these three. The long count is basically this calendar that starts in a point 0 and that will continue, just counting days and days and days, starting from one main date, which is the date for Ahaut Ekunku. This date roughly corresponds to August the 13th of the year 3114 BC. And what happened on that date is actually something that's open to discussion, but it's basically this scenario. the gods in a assembly of gods ordained the universe, ordained the world. And we have the celestial and the terrestrial gods holding bundles that hold the stars and the earth. So they are, in this date, they are holding this assembly and they are deciding to put the world in order. So we know that the long count for the Maya was basically counting from the creation of the universe as we know it. They were telling us the precise day in which they were doing things starting from this era event, this era date, this benchmark that they had. You can see the drawings here a little bit more clear. The date itself is here, exactly. Oh, you cannot see my hand moving here, but it's this facey that you can see with the 2 dots, which are actually 4 dots over here. That's the date of the creation. And the long count was basically organized into 5 main periods. You have the Baktun, you have the Katun, you have the Tun, the Winal, and the Kin. And these are just basically groupings of days. You know, like in English, we will say we have a day, 7 days are a week, 4 weeks are a month, 12 months are a year, 5 years are a score of years, 10 years are a decade. When you have 10 decades together, you have a century. When you have 10 centuries together, you have a millennium. And you know, we organize the time in a very similar way. In the case of the Maya, we have days. When you have 20 days, you get a winal. When you have 18 of these winals, you get a tun, which are 360 days. When you get 20 of these tuns, you get a katun. And when you get 20 katuns, you get a baktun. I know I'm going too fast on this. I'm so sorry. But basically what you need to get from this is that the long count is essentially a chronometer that's telling us on which day, exactly on which day after the universe was created, we are doing something. And just as a reference, if you want to see it, at the beginning of the presentation, I don't know if you noticed it, here you have the long count date of today. We are on the 13th Baktun, on the 0 Katun, on the 8th Tun, on the first Winal, on the 19th day since the universe was created. So you're ready, you can start counting from today if you want. Let me see, let me go back. So for example, a typical long count date will have this element, which is the initial series glyph as the
Sorry, something went wrong. Please try again later.
Oh, sorry. I think I activated Cortana by accident. I'm sorry. So here, the introductory sign looks like this. It's basically this big sign on the top of the inscriptions. And immediately after it, you will find a different time, that different periods, the Baktun, the Katun, the Tun, the Winal, and the Kin, like in this example. Let me move a little bit forward. The next calendar that we can find is usually the Tzolkin, also known as Chok'ich. These are basically these 20-day names, and these 20-day names have different combinations with numbers. So you will always find them in connection with a number from 1 to 13. And usually they look like this, and you will find them instead of looking like this. And the element in the center is what changes. And you have 20 different options. And these 20 different options are basically like God days. And these horas, that's how we call them in Ahobal, these days have attributes. And they're like, they have attitudes and they have response times and they have different ways of connecting with the human beings. And it's very important that you know on which of these days you were born. For example, today we have the day Kawak. And Kawak has certain attributes that will affect you as a person if you were born in this day. And you are not supposed to tell the people on which day you were born, because if you tell them, people will know how to tackle you in a certain way or how to manage you. So having your day name is a secret that you're supposed not to share with other people. So someone that's born in Kawak is not the same as someone born in Ok or in Kimi. They are different people. And I want to address another important thing that these names that I'm showing you are the names in Yucatec Maya. But in the different 30 languages that we know from the Maya, there are different names, like we have for the days of the week. In Spanish, we call lunes the day that you call in English Monday, but it's the same calendar, it's the same week. And it's the same thing with the Maya. For example, some people will call Kemi, they will call it Kame. In the Ahobal language, we will call it Tosh. So it's the same day, but it changes from language to language. But in the academic scientific study of Maya writing, we use Yucatec Maya names. Yep. And this is a calendar that's actually known throughout Mesoamerica. You can find it among the Mystics, among the Aztecs. And this is just an example just to show you the equivalence. For example, the day that I was showing you, Kimi, Keme, is actually the day death among the Aztecs or the Mystics. So we see that many of the concepts go through different cultures. How does this work? It's basically like this. It's this combination of the two rounds of numbers and day names. And the animation is not so great, but it works. So you get an idea of how it works. It is used basically to conduct human life. People can know how to do things, when to ask for a favor, when to say thanks for this favor. That's what this calendar is used for, basically to conduct your life. And you will find it throughout Guatemala in many different places. The form of the glyphs is a revitalization movement. This is something that people were getting to know in the 80s, and the Maya are taking back their writing system, and they are using it in different places. For example, the day keepers, the akih, you can see them here making a glyph with sugar as part of a ceremony. And Maya ceremonies are essentially conducted on specific days connected to this calendar. Very important is that, for example, the post-classic papers that we know, they are basically calendars written in paper. The same calendars that the people today in Guatemala keep, just in an oral form. So we know that this knowledge is very deeply ingrained in the Maya civilization up to today. The last calendar that I wanted to mention today is the Hab, which is the solar calendar. And again, the names that you see here, like Pop, Wo, Sip, Sots, and etc., are the Yucatec names of the months. What's the difference with this calendar? This calendar has 18 month names. In our calendar, we have 12. So the glyphs you see are Pop, Wo, Sip, but those are the names of the months. In our calendar, the months are of 30 or 31 days, except for February. We all know why. In the Maya system, it's different. All the months have exactly the same amount of time. They have 20 days. But this causes that there's a extra, 5 days that are left without the correct month. So these are the so-called wayeb, or the unlucky or bad days. Yeah, we have different names for them here. Sorry. All these names are here. In different Maya languages, these extra 5 days are called in different ways. Wayeb is the name that Yucatec Maya use. Tzapekich or Ok'i or Oyebku are the names that you will find in different Maya languages. So what happens with these extra 5 days? They're just floating around, and they are considered dangerous by the Maya people. And they are important, but they are also seen as a time of fasting, of preparation for the new year. And this is something that I am actually researching right now as part of my PhD. So essentially, the Hab is a Maya calendar, it's a solar Maya calendar that has only 365 days. There is no leap year, never. So this is a very important feature that you need to remember. The combination of the Hab and the Tzolkin creates what we call the calendar round. And the calendar round is basically the Mesoamerican century. So a date like Eitahau 13 Kiech will only happen every 52 years. And this is a cycle that's very important in Mesoamerican histories. If you have heard about the Aztec new fire ceremonies, these are the ones that happen every 52 years, for example, which mark the end of a Mesoamerican century. So I think we're almost over. I just want to show you something that's very interesting. And it's also that you can find that the Maya are producing glyphs today. You know, there's a strong revitalization movement in Guatemala and in Mexico, and Belize also now. You can find that many Maya are taking back this kind of Maya writing. They're actually using it in a public display of identity. So if you happen to go to Guatemala, if you happen to go to Yucatan, you will find many glyphs, new glyphs, which is basically the Maya taking over back their heritage. And a lot of the people that are supporting this kind of developments are, for example, MAM, Mayas for Ancient Mayan, or the Maya meetings, or the Guatemalan government. They are trying to teach the Maya back, because the Maya people are now in this very strong seeking for knowledge. They're like in this search for information, in this search for knowledge about their past. And the Maya writing is seen as a key feature in this element. For example, they are producing codices, reproduction of Maya codices, and these are being done by the Maya themselves. We have congresses about Maya writing, conferences about Maya writing, organized by the Maya themselves. There's amazing scribes. For example, if you find Walter Paz Hoch, he's a great Maya scribe. He's basically the best Maya scribe I've seen in Guatemala, and he produces these amazing pieces of art. So you can check these kind of things. And this is showing you that the Maya are taking back over their heritage. And this is super important. And one of the main things that happened in Guatemala was that in 2012, when people were talking about the end of the world and these things, the Maya were not talking about the end of the world, but they were starting to look back in history, and they started producing stelae. And today, if you go to Guatemala, you can find the stelae of Iximché, for example. And this stele is basically recounting the story of the Cachiquel Maya, but written in Maya glyphs. So this was a way of saying like, hey, we're still here, we're not disappearing. You have to take us into account, and this is our history, and we're taking it back. So I think that's it. Thank you for your time and your support. So, gracias. Igual Dios.
Now you've had several questions come in. This is Catherine, by the way. And so the first one that came in right at the beginning was, do you teach any spoken Maya, Yucatan or otherwise?
Catherine, I don't hear you. Hello?
Can you hear me?
Hola, hola.
Yes, we can hear you now.
Yeah.
You can? Okay. So the first question was, do you also teach spoken Maya, Yucatan or otherwise?
No, I don't speak Yucatec Maya. I'm actually learning Ajobal. This is something that we need to talk about with Luis and Adaluz at some point. But no, I don't teach Yucatec Maya. But if you want to find a Yucatec Maya teacher, I can put you in contact with some friends and colleagues. So my email, I left it here. Let me share presentation again. What's this? Yeah, you can see it here. So if you want to get in touch with me later, you can send me an email and we can talk about this.
And we can also hear for the Maya organization based in Omaha. We might be also teaching some Anjobal Maya as well. We just wanted to share with you that now we will have our online based radio station, but also online based television. So we will be producing a lot of programs like this. And so just follow us on our social media, and send us email as well as Professor Garay, but also connect with us again at Pishanishim, and we will keep you updated.
Yep, I think that you should keep following us in the social media, because this is just the first presentation of something that will be happening hopefully very often from now on. And definitely I will be signing in for the Ajobal course. So it will be great to see you there.
The next question is, who were/are the Mayans' indigenous neighbors to the north and south? the American school books only recognized Aztecs, Nahuatl, or to the south and the Incas, or sorry, to the north and the Incas to the south?
Okay, that's a good question. Maybe I should try to put this in the map so that you know what we're talking about. Let me try to, okay, I will try to share screen again. You see the whiteboard? You see my whiteboard right now?
Now we do.
Yep, okay. So this is a very rough drawing, yeah? Very rough. This is Yucatan, the Petén, Guatemala, yeah? So to the north, you have the Aztecs in central Mexico. But here you have the Gulf Coast of Mexico. Oh, sorry. The Gulf Coast was populated by different groups. You have the Totonacs, you have the Huastecs, you have the Olmecs. For example, here you have Oaxaca. Oaxaca is a Mexican state, federal state. And Oaxaca was populated by the Mixtecs, by the Zapotecs, by the Huave people, and there's just so many. To the east, you have Honduras, and you have El Salvador. In this area, for example, you have the Xinca, which is the other indigenous group in Guatemala, but they don't speak Maya languages. They speak Xinca, which is a language that it's endangered and might disappear soon. Also in Honduras and in El Salvador, you have the Lencas, and you have the Pipil Maya, sorry, the Pipil Nahuatl, sorry. Just to give you a general idea, but there's a bunch of indigenous groups that they still live in these areas. So if you just go to, if you go to Wikipedia and you check Mesoamerica, that's an important term you need to check, Mesoamerica. If you check this term, you can find a bunch of cultures and indigenous groups that are still in these areas and that were historically present in these areas. Yep.
So our next question,
Okay.
Did it transform from ideographic to a syllabic/phonemic type of writing throughout the Mayan stages?
So, sorry, can you repeat the question again?
Did it transform from ideographic to a syllabic/phonemic type of writing throughout the Mayan stages?
Okay, the thing is that actually the development of the writing itself tells us and shows us that the Maya writing was already quite developed from the beginning. We know that at the start, it was more logographic. It seems to have been more and more logographic. And as time passed by, more phonetic signs were developed, more syllables were developed. But the Maya system is actually a combination of both of them. You cannot actually separate one of them from the other. So it was never purely logographic and it was never purely phonographic. Yeah, it was a combination of both. But what we do see is that by the time, for example, the first examples of writing from 200 AD or 200 BC, they show a lot of logographic signs, a lot of these word signs, like the words written with one glyph. And as time passes by, 1,000 years later, by the end of the classic period, for example, around the year 900, 1000, 1100, what we see is that there's a more focus on phonetic signs. They want to be more phonetically transparent when they are writing, but they never abandon the usage of the logographs. They are still present. Yep.
So the next question, and you touched on this some, but if you want to expand, how much has the Mayan language changed since the classic and post-classic periods? Is it like modern English versus Shakespearean English, or is it like modern English versus Beowulf English, i.e. impossible to read without modern translation?
Okay, the closest language that we have to classic Mayan is Chorti, or Chol, or the Yocotan, which is the Chontal of Tabasco in Mexico. These three languages are basically like the daughters or close cousins to classic Maya, the closest thing we have. And even one of the speakers of these languages, will have a lot of challenging moments when reading a Maya inscription. But of course, for a Maya speaker, it will make more sense to understand these kind of inscriptions than to a speaker, for example, of Nahuatl, which is another indigenous language, but that it's not related to Maya. Yeah. And how much it has changed. I think that, you know, from the time of classic Maya, we're talking about a 5th or 6th century, up to our time. So it's very hard to read if you are not familiar with it. So I will say that it's close to Beowulf English, you know, like Modern English and Beowulf English. This kind of very big gap where you can understand especially some words of vocabulary, but the grammar, you know, the syntax has changed so much that certain things are just very hard to decipher. For example, even for a native speaker of a Mayan language, especially one of the native speakers of these Cholan languages, like Chortí in Guatemala, or Chol or Chontal in Mexico. And yeah, basically, yeah, imagine it's a very good comparison. I really like this. This was from Juliana. This was a very good example because, you know, Beowulf English is understandable in very, very, very small degree. And you can see that the English from 1,000 years ago was already quite hard, but suddenly with the influx of French speakers from Normandy, after the conquest of William of England, you see that this English starts feeling a little bit more similar to what we know today as English. So, yeah, but I think it's a very nice comparison. So classic Mayan and the modern Chola languages are like Beowulf and contemporaneous English, basically.
So next question, is there much or any similarity from Mayan hieroglyphics in their confines to the Florentine Codex?
Okay. You know, the thing is that the Florentine Codex, what you see in the illustrations of the Florentine Codex or on the works of Sahagún in general, these were made ex professo to illustrate different elements basically in this colonial encyclopedia that he was putting up. And certain things are similar. For example, I don't remember the word in English, the virgula, the virgule that you use in Nahua writing. You can find very similar kind of elements in Maya imagery. So these elements, yes, they are similar. Also, the poses that you can see of certain characters. For example, there's like this kind of pan-Mesoamerican motifs, especially on how you put the hands, on how you display the body. And you can see that some of these elements go from Maya to Nahua to Mixtec, and in all these systems, you can actually identify them at the same time. For example, when you see people being grabbed by the hair, yeah, you know this is a pan-Mesoamericanism for being captive. Someone make you captive if they're cutting your hair, they're catching you in this way. Or another example of this pan-Mesoamerican motifs is the hand being placed over the body in this way. I hope you're seeing me. So if you see people with the hand weeping, with the hand like this, you know that it is a gesture of sadness and sorrow throughout the Maya area, throughout central Mexico. So you have these kind of things. I mean, in this non-specifically writing, but more like imagery, yes, you find certain coincidences because they actually come from a general pattern that was understood throughout Mesoamerica. And yeah, but specifically on writing, you have to understand that Nahua writing and Maya writing, they are related systems, but they are very different. You know, it's like, let me put a good example on this. For example, like Etruscan and I don't know, or even better, like the Roman alphabet and the runic systems. You know, they're both alphabets. They are working basically on the same principles, but at the same time, they are different. So I don't know if this is clear enough, But yes, you can see some elements of similarity and shared heritage in between these Mesoamerican people.
Next question. Was there any point in time where Olmecs and Mayans coexisted? And how did the Olmecs influence the Mayans?
Okay, yeah, they coexisted in the pre-classic period. You know, there's a very interesting work that's being done right now by the team that's working in Aguada Phoenix. If you can look for this paper, it's by Takeshi Inomata. And you know, Aguada Phoenix is as early as many of the Olmec sites in the Olmec heartland. So we know that the Maya and the Olmecs coexisted and that they were actually developing many technologies at the same time. And there was a lot of influence and movements of ideas and concepts in between these groups. So there's always this very big discussion, Rebecca, yeah? There's always this very big discussion of the idea of the mother culture. It was so important for a long time when we had the diffusionism as the main school of thought in Mexican anthropology and in the US anthropology and archaeology. And this is very hard to fight because it's so deeply ingrained into academia right now. But now we have a way more complex scenario. And we know that the Maya and other groups were already as developed as the Olmecs. By the time, you know, that the Olmecs were in their heights, we know that the Maya were also building very big cities. So they did coexisted, but there's always this feeling that the Olmecs are a bit earlier and that they have like a very deeper, you know, footprint on Mesoamerica, because you can find so many Olmec things everywhere. But of course, there's always this discussion if we should talk about Olmecs as a style, you know, like as a artistic style, or if you should talk about them as a culture. So it's open to interpretations. But yes, what we call Olmec, you know, like early pre-classic or even early middle pre-classic, yes, it did coexist with the Maya, especially at the latter period of their development.
The next question, the person writes, I'm curious about the debate of the meaning shock. Why would epigraphers argue that the English word shark doesn't come from the Yucatec word shock? I'm just curious.
Okay, I'm probably not the best person for that. The thing is that it's, you know, it's an open discussion because it seems that the word shark did not exist in English, I think that before the 14th century. And now there's someone found an evidence that there might be a reference to the word shark in a 14th or 13th century documents, but in England, but this is open to discussion. The thing is that shock, you know, phonetically, it sounds very similar to shark. And it's not a coincidence that the word is talking about the same animal, but it seems that shark in English, if it existed in English in an independent way, it was supposed to make reference to a big fish or something like this. So it's still open to debate. I will just suggest that you Google a little bit about it, and you will find that there's a very nice academic articles discussing this kind of etymologies. But yeah, it's still open to question. The thing is that the word for shark has a very dark etymology, and we don't know a lot of its origin. It's the same kind of discussion that we have about the word for cigarettes. You know, cigarette has been suggested that it comes from different Maya languages, where the word for smoke is sic or sicar. So, you know, there was no cigarette in England before the discovery of America, of our continent. So, yeah, it makes sense that people talking about tobacco got this word from an Amerindian language. And the thing is that the Maya were deeply, you know, ingrained as consumers of tobacco. Tobacco was so important for the Maya. So we know that it's very likely that tobacco, you know, was introduced to the Spaniards, and the Spaniards got it to Europe. And then you also have the tobacco plantations in North America, in the southern states of the US. So it's a lot of discussions, but many of these words are very likely Amerindian in origin.
So the next question, was the language Was the language complexity designed to limit who could record, read, communicate Mayans' experience? Was it for protection, ensuring fidelity in the narratives documented? Curious about what inspired such complexity.
Sorry, I think I found a question. It's by Talma Ishutz. Okay. Okay, the language, the complexity of the language there is not intentional. It's the language the way it is. The complexity of the writing system is a different thing. And we have to understand that the spoken language and the written language are two different kind of codes. So the spoken language is not harder or more complex. It's just, it is what it is. The thing is that the written system was complex, but at the same time, it was molded to the Maya language. So it's like writing Maya languages using the Maya syllabary or the Maya logographs and syllabary. It's very easy. But it's not the same thing, for example, if I try to use the Maya syllabary to write English or to write Spanish, it's super complicated. So actually the writing system was connected to the phonetics and the structure of the language that he was writing. So in this case, it was not that it was more complex or intentionally designed to be complicated. It's just that it's reflecting the structure of the language. And there was, I think, Aurelie Juliet also had a question. Are any of the currently spoken Maya languages currently considered endangered? Yes, many Maya languages are actually endangered at this time. We have languages that have less than 100 speakers, like Itza Maya or Mocho in Mexico. Itza is spoken in Guatemala, in Petén, and Mocho is spoken in Chiapas, in southern Chiapas. So if you just go through a list of the Maya languages, you know that a few of them have less than some 10,000 speakers. So they're actually endangered. So, sorry, Catherine.
That's okay. So another question, did any of the surrounding non-Mayan groups adopt writing similar to the Maya writing and try to adapt it to their different languages, like Chinese characters for Japanese?
Yeah, there's many nice works that you can actually check by Steve Houston and other colleagues. And they talk about these ideas that certain, like the way the Maya writing work, you can see that's very similar to, for example, how Nahua writing works. And in Mesoamerica, you basically have like two very big branches of writing systems that are connected because of their mechanics. And you can see this, for example, in other parts of the world, like Japan and China. Like Japanese writing is derived from Chinese, but once again, because Chinese writing is thought of for a tonal language, while Japanese is a language that is, what do you call these ones? The one that put things up together. I don't remember right now, I just forgot the name. The ones that make very, like analytical languages. Japanese and Chinese are structurally very different. Japanese is actually a very simple grammar language. And Chinese has this problem that it's even simpler, but the tone system is completely over the language. So even though the Japanese took over the Chinese writing system, they actually had to adapt it to their own needs. And they created new signs in order to make it work for themselves. So you can see this phenomena in China and Japan. And also you had Vietnamese. Vietnamese was written also in Chinese characters, and Korean. And even though they did this for a long time, they had to adapt and create new symbols to make it work. With the case of the Maya, we do know that some of these symbols were actually pan-Mesoamerican. You can find very similar symbols in Aztec writing, in Mixtec writing, in Zapotec writing. And what we don't see is that there's a lot of diffusion of the symbols after a certain time. After, let's say, the 300, 400, the systems become more or less like solid, like they have a solid core that can be defined. But we do know that there was a lot of exchange of this visual language. And for example, the closest written language that we can see apparently is epiolmic writing, which was used in La Mojarra and in other epiolmic sites in the Tehuantepec Isthmus. And for example, the Maya long count seems to have been developed by the Epi-Olmec people, and the Maya took over it and added a number of things to it. So we know that there was diffusion of ideas, of concepts, of even elements of writing, but it was not as complex as it happened in East Asia, for example.
So I've got just a few more questions, and they're very broad, so I will let you decide how long you want to answer them, since I know it's really late there.
Okay.
But one of them is, what was the relationship between the Maya and their neighbors to the north and south, depending on the time, of course?
Okay, that's a complicated question. Short thing is that the Maya were actually quite isolated in many of their time. I mean, throughout time, many times they were quite isolated. And for example, we know that in the classic period, according to the inscriptions, I mean, that's not something that I am inventing, it's just what we read in the inscriptions. We know that, for example, the Maya lowlands were occupied or at least were conquered at a time by Teotihuacan people. We know from the inscriptions in Tikal that in the early years of the 4th century, in the later years of the 4th century, in 378, a group of Teotihuacanos came down from Teotihuacan and took over the Maya lowlands, at least Tikal itself. So we know that there was these interactions. There was a lot of communication, like I was telling, there's ideas, there's concepts, even gods, you know, the notion of certain gods and the imagery associated with these gods was transmitted from one zone to the other one. So we know that things from Central Mexico were coming to the Maya, but we also know that things from the Maya were going to Central Mexico. So I was telling you about the Teotihuacanos getting to Tikal. We also know that there were Maya living in Teotihuacan. There's like a Maya barrio, you know, like a neighborhood of Maya living in Teotihuacan. And in Teotihuacan, we also have a Zapotec neighborhood. We also have a neighborhood from the people of West Mexico living in Teotihuacan. So we know that there was a lot of moving around. So in the early classic, we know about this arrival of Teotihuacan people to the Maya area. This is actually, archaeologically speaking, one of the features that allows us to speak of an early classic period. So in the case of the lowlands, we have this reference in the epigraphic inscriptions. But for example, in the Pacific coast, in the Pacific Piedmont in Guatemala, we see that there's a lot of ceramic materials, ceramic censers that are being produced in Teotihuacan style locally. So we know that there was some kind of Teotihuacano people living in southern Guatemala in the early classic, sorry. Caminal Huyu sees a dramatic shift in the architecture and the ceramics also connected to Teotihuacan. So we know that the early classic was actually defined by these Teotihuacanos coming to the Maya area, but at the same time, Maya influence was going up to Central Mexico. Regarding the populations of Honduras and El Salvador, which are the direct neighbors to the south, we don't have a lot of references about them. We don't have a lot of information. What we do know is that many of these Lenca or proto-Lencan groups were actually adopting Maya canons of ceramics. They started producing ceramics as imitations of Maya things, especially like Ulua ceramics or Salua, if you find them in El Salvador. But we also know that there was interaction because we find objects from this area in the Maya region and objects from the Maya region in the southern areas. For example, many jade kilts, you know, carved jade objects have been found in Costa Rica with glyphs, with Maya glyphs. So we know that the Maya were trading with the people from Costa Rica somehow, and that they were bringing things from the Maya area down to Costa Rica, and things from Costa Rica were probably arriving to the Maya area. It's just that we don't have writing from the Costa Rican people. We don't have writing from the people in Honduras. We just have writings from the Maya, and they just didn't wrote about, you know, they trade and their taxes. So we know that there's a lot of movements, and we know that by the late post-classic and the early post-classic, there were very big migrations of people from Central Mexico to the Maya area. And that's how we got the Nahua Pipiles in El Salvador and Guatemala. So, but I can tell you that there's a lot of movements. There's a few papers that you can check. I would suggest that you look at Michael Smith's paper and also at Love's papers. There's a lot of things. You can send me an email and we can talk about this.
So second to last question, what about the Teotihuacan? Could you talk more about the cultural relations between them, which I know you just touched on? Did they have an influence on each other's languages?
Okay, well, I was basically talking about that, but just adding to it, because we talk about languages, there's a big controversy that, we're still dealing with this question. What language did the Teotihuacanos spoke? This is still an open question. Some people will say they spoke Otomí, which is in Ñañú, in central Mexico. Other people will say that they spoke Totonac or some form of Totonac. Other people will say that they spoke Nahuatl. And what we know is that in certain Maya inscriptions, especially coming from Tikal and the Central Lowlands, at this time when we got Teotihuacanos moving to this area, we have certain very odd glyphs. We have these glyphs that try to transcribe something that's not Maya. And we have these very nice examples come from El Marcador de Tikal, where we think that the Maya were actually trying to write the language of the Teotihuacanos. So the best guesses that we have to interpret these glyphs is that they are in Nahuatl. The problem with this is that Nahuatl, according to the linguist, was not in central Mexico around this time. Nahuatl arrived to central Mexico around 800, 900. So it is too early because the inscriptions in Tikal are from the 4th century. So linguists don't agree with this idea that Teotihuacanos getting to the lowlands of Guatemala were speaking Nahuatl. That would be just a linguistic scenario that a lot of people don't accept. But the problem is that the evidence points to that. So we have this controversy that's still open. Unfortunately, we need more information. As long as we don't find more evidence, we cannot close the case. So we know that Nahuatl has a deep impact in Maya languages. We have a lot of loanwords in Maya languages, but at the same time, we have loanwords from Maya languages into languages in Central Mexico. For example, we have loanwords in Guave, which is a coastal language in Oaxaca, coming from Maya languages. And these are scenarios that usually we're not talking about, but we know that there was mutual influence from the two sides.
And the final question, which again, we also already touched on a little bit, but do you teach any other virtual classes that could be joined?
Right now, no, but maybe we can organize something here. Maybe we'll have some other short talks like this one, because this was basically just a wraparound, it was very quick. And it's basically just to open the possibility of making more of this. So I would love to hear from you, and I will ask you if you're interested in more of these courses. Why don't you write to the Pishanishim page? You can give them a shout out in Facebook, like, hey, when do we have the next class? And we can organize something about this. But you can write me all the time, yeah.
It's time to say thank you. Catherine, thank you, Ellen, Professor Garay. We started at 2 o'clock in the morning in Germany. It is probably now 4 o'clock in the morning, maybe more.
Yeah, it's 4.
And so kind, generous contribution to the cause here. And a lot of you that came, again, follow us on our social media, continue sharing. And so, I mean, words always get in the way when it comes to expressing gratitude here. Thank you from Pishanishim, everyone. And if anyone wants to show your face or something, just wave by. Really, this is it, unless there's anything else from Catherine or, but otherwise, thank you, Ellen. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Thelma, Mark. Thanks, everyone. Catherine, our behind the scenes leader over there. So, gracias a todos. Gracias.
Well, Dios, thank you, and have a good Friday. Yep.
Gracias. Gracias a la luz.
Enjoy the weekend.
You too. Gracias a la luz.
Su micrófono estaba apagado a la luz.
Sí, decía gracias. Muchas gracias a todos y a Alejandro también. Igual Dios ahí es Masanil.
Igual Dios es chup.